I was sitting in my home office when I saw the HOA president walk right past my window with a bolt cutter in her hands, and I knew exactly what she was about to do. My name is Brandon Hart, and I had been living in the Meadowbrook Estates community in Phoenix, Arizona for about 3 years. The neighborhood was one of those cookie-cutter developments with identical houses painted in various shades of beige and tan, manicured lawns that all looked suspiciously similar, and an HOA that seemed to think it owned everyone who lived there. I worked from home as a federal contractor, specifically doing cybersecurity work for the Department of Defense, which meant I had clearance and equipment that required special storage considerations. 6 months earlier, I had purchased a military-grade storage container to keep some of my sensitive equipment and backup servers. The container was one of those heavy-duty steel units, about 20 feet long, painted in standard military green. I had it delivered and placed it on my property, specifically on the concrete pad behind my house that was clearly within my property lines. I had checked the HOA bylaws thoroughly before making the purchase. The rules stated that storage structures were allowed as long as they were not visible from the street and did not exceed certain dimensions. My container met all those requirements, but that was before Deborah Finch became the HOA president. Deborah was the textbook definition of a Karen. She was in her mid-40s, had that signature haircut where it was longer in the front and shorter in the back, and she wore oversized sunglasses even on cloudy days. She drove a white Escalade with a bumper sticker that read, "I speak to managers professionally." I was not making that up. She actually had that sticker. 3 months after I installed my container, Deborah knocked on my door. It was a Saturday morning, and I was enjoying my coffee when I heard the aggressive rapping on my front door. "Mr. Hart," she said when I opened it, not even bothering with a greeting. "We need to discuss your storage situation." "Good morning, Deborah," I replied, emphasizing the greeting she had skipped. "What storage situation? That eyesore behind your house. Several neighbors have complained." "Several neighbors who can apparently see through my house?" I asked. "Because the container is not visible from the street or from any neighboring property. I made sure of that." "It is a violation of our community standards," she insisted, crossing her arms. "Show me where in the bylaws," I said calmly. I had learned early on that the best way to deal with HOA nonsense was to know the rules better than they did. Her face turned red. "It is clearly a storage shed, and all storage sheds require approval." "It is not a shed. It is a container. And the bylaws do not require approval for storage structures under 25 feet that are not visible from common areas or the street." "I will be bringing this up at the next board meeting," she huffed and walked away. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Over the next 2 months, I received 3 written warnings about my container. Each one cited different, increasingly vague violations. First, it was about maintaining community aesthetics. Then it was about unpermitted structures. Finally, it was about commercial equipment in a residential zone, which was absurd because the container stored equipment. It was not itself commercial equipment. I responded to each letter with detailed citations from the actual HOA bylaws, showing that I was in full compliance. I even had a surveyor come out and verify that the container was entirely on my property and met all setback requirements. I sent that documentation to the board as well. That brings us to today, a Wednesday morning in late March, when I saw Deborah marching past my window with that bolt cutter. I jumped up from my desk and ran outside. By the time I got to my backyard, Deborah was already cutting the lock off my container. 2 other HOA board members stood behind her, both looking uncomfortable but not stopping her. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" I shouted as I ran toward them. Deborah turned to face me, the broken lock in her hand. This container is being seized by the HOA for community use. You have repeatedly violated community standards and failed to remove it after multiple warnings. You cannot just seize my property, I said, trying to keep my voice level despite the rage building inside me. That is theft. It is not theft. It is enforcement of HOA regulations. You signed the CC and Articus when you purchased your home, which gives the board authority to remove violations. The authority to remove violations after proper legal proceedings, not to just steal someone's property, I shot back. And there is no violation. I have proven that multiple times. The board has voted and the decision is final, Deborah said with a smug smile. We will be using this container to store community maintenance equipment. You should be happy. You are finally contributing something useful to the neighborhood. One of the other board members, a man named Rick who usually kept his head down, spoke up nervously. Deborah, maybe we should wait for the lawyer to review this again. We already waited long enough, Deborah snapped at him. Open the container. That was when I pulled out my phone and started recording. For the record, I am explicitly denying you permission to access my property. You are trespassing, and you are attempting to steal federal equipment. Deborah paused. Federal equipment? I am a DOD contractor. Some of the equipment in that container is government property under my custody. You are about to commit a federal crime. Her face went pale for a moment, but then that stubborn Karen determination set back in. You are bluffing. If it was really federal equipment, you would not keep it in a storage container. It is properly secured storage for backup equipment and non-classified materials. But it is still government property and you do not have authorization to access it. Deborah rolled her eyes. Rick, help me with this door. Rick looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, but he reluctantly moved forward. The third board member, a woman named Susan, actually backed away. I did not agree to this, Susan said. I am leaving. Fine, go, Deborah said dismissively. I was still recording as Deborah and Rick opened the container doors. Inside were several equipment racks, backup servers, networking gear, and various tools and testing equipment. Everything was neatly organized and properly labeled. See? Nothing federal here. Just a bunch of computer junk, Deborah said triumphantly, though I could tell she had no idea what she was looking at. Those servers, I said, pointing to 3 specific units, are property of the Department of Defense. Those 2 racks contain backup equipment for a federal contract I am currently working. And that entire section contains encrypted storage drives with data covered under federal security regulations. Whatever, Deborah said. The HOA is taking possession of this container. You have 30 days to remove your stuff, and then we will be moving our equipment in. That is not how this works, I said, but Deborah was already walking away, the broken lock still in her hand. Rick gave me an apologetic look. Sorry, man. She is really on a power trip lately. You just participated in stealing federal property, I told him. I would get a lawyer if I were you. He paled and hurried after Deborah. I stood there for a moment, my phone still recording, looking at my opened container. Then I did what any rational person would do in 2025. I backed up my recording to 3 different cloud services, sent a copy to my personal email, and then made a phone call. My primary point of contact at the DOD was a man named Lieutenant Colonel James Peterson. We had worked together for about 5 years, and he knew my setup. I had his direct line for emergencies. Hart, what is going on? He answered, clearly seeing my name on the caller ID. Sir, I need to report a security incident. My storage location for project backup equipment has been compromised by unauthorized individuals. There was a pause. Explain, I gave him a brief rundown of what had just happened. As I talked, I could hear his breathing getting heavier. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," he said slowly. "Your homeowners association just broke into a secure storage location containing DOD equipment." "Yes, sir. I have video documentation." "Send it to me immediately. Do not touch anything else. I am making some calls." He hung up, and I sent him the video. Then I went back inside, locked my doors, and waited. I also called my own lawyer, a guy named Tom Chen who specialized in property law and HOA disputes. I had him on retainer specifically because I knew the HOA was going to be a problem eventually. Tom answered on the second ring. "Brandon, what has she done now?" I explained the situation. Tom was silent for a long moment. "She actually seized your container, just took it, cut my lock off and declared it HOA property. That is conversion at minimum, possibly theft." "And if there is really federal equipment involved?" "There is. I have already notified my DOD contact." "Good. Do not engage with the HOA anymore. Let me handle this from the legal side. I am going to file for an emergency injunction this afternoon." "Thanks, Tom." After hanging up, I tried to get back to work, but I could not concentrate. I kept looking out the window at my container, which now sat there with its doors closed but no lock on it. Anyone could access it. About an hour later, I saw Deborah return with 2 men in a truck. They started unloading lawnmowers, leaf blowers, and other landscaping equipment from the truck, clearly intending to store it in my container. I called Tom immediately. "They are loading their equipment into it right now. Do not confront them. Keep recording everything. This is actually good for us. The more evidence of conversion, the better." I recorded from my window as they spent the next 30 minutes loading equipment into my container. Deborah stood there supervising, that smug smile never leaving her face. Around 3 in the afternoon, things got interesting. I was still working, or at least pretending to, when I heard vehicles pull up outside. I looked out my front window and saw 2 black SUVs and a sedan. Men in suits got out, along with 2 individuals in uniforms I immediately recognized. U.S. Marshals. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson stepped out of the sedan. I opened my front door as they approached. "Mr. Hart?" one of the marshals asked. "Yes, sir." "I am Marshal David Rodriguez. We need access to your storage container, of course. It is around back." I led them through my house to the backyard. Peterson gave me a nod. "Hart, where is the HOA president?" "Probably at home. She lives 3 streets over." "Address?" I gave it to him, and he sent 2 of the men in suits in that direction. Then the marshals and several others approached my container. One of them pulled the doors open, and I could see the confusion on their faces when they saw the lawnmowers and landscaping equipment mixed in with my technical gear. "What is all this?" Marshal Rodriguez asked. "The HOA moved their equipment in after they seized the container this morning," I explained. Peterson looked like he was about to have a stroke. "They moved their lawn equipment into a container with DOD property." "Yes, sir." He turned to the other men, who I now realized were likely federal agents of some kind. "Document everything. Photograph every piece of equipment, both Hart's and this other garbage. I want a complete inventory." They got to work while Peterson turned to me. "Walk me through exactly what happened." I showed him the video on my phone while the agents worked. His jaw got tighter with each passing second. When the video ended, he shook his head. "Unbelievable. In my 20 years of service, I have never seen such blatant disregard for basic law, let alone federal security protocols." "To be fair, I do not think she believed it was actually federal equipment," I said. "That is not a defense," Peterson said. "Ignorance of the law is not an excuse, and she was explicitly told before she opened the container." About 20 minutes later, the two agents returned with Deborah. She was protesting loudly as they led her into my backyard. "This is harassment. I am the HOA president. I was enforcing community standards," she was practically shrieking. Marshal Rodriguez stepped forward. "Madam, I am U.S. Marshal David Rodriguez. Are you Deborah Finch, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association?" "Yes, and I demand to know why I was dragged from my home." "You are not under arrest, madam. We are conducting an investigation." "Did you, this morning, cut the lock off this storage container and claim it for HOA use?" "I exercised the HOA's authority to remove a violation from the property, yes." "Were you aware that this container held federal property?" He claimed that, but I did not believe him. "It is just computer equipment." Peterson stepped forward, his face red. "Just computer equipment. Madam, do you have any idea what you have done?" "I enforced HOA regulations," Deborah said, her chin jutting out stubbornly. "You compromised a secure federal location. You potentially exposed classified material. You interfered with an active DoD contract. And you did all of this after being explicitly warned that you were dealing with federal property." Deborah's confidence wavered slightly. "It cannot be that serious. It is just some computers in a storage container." Marshal Rodriguez consulted with one of the agents, then turned back to Deborah. "Madam, at this time, we are seizing this container and all federal property within it as evidence in an ongoing investigation. You and your HOA board members may face federal charges depending on the outcome of that investigation." "Federal charges? For what?" "Theft of government property, interference with a federal contract, and potentially unauthorized access to secure materials." "The exact charges will be determined by the U.S. Attorney's Office." The color drained from Deborah's face. "I want my lawyer." "That is your right, madam. However, you are not currently under arrest. We are simply notifying you that this property is now under federal control pending investigation." One of the agents had been examining the equipment inside the container. He came over and spoke quietly to Peterson and the marshal. I could not hear everything, but I caught phrases like "no obvious tampering" and "seals intact." Peterson turned to me. "Hart, the good news is that your federal equipment appears to be undamaged and unsecured. The bad news is that we are going to need to take it all into custody temporarily while we conduct a security review." "I understand, sir. What about my personal equipment?" "We will inventory everything. What is yours will be returned once we clear it. How quickly can you identify what is federal property versus your personal gear?" "I have detailed documentation. I can send you the inventory lists within an hour." "Do that." Deborah spoke up, her voice now shaky. "What about the HOA's equipment that is in there?" Marshal Rodriguez looked at her with barely concealed disdain. "Your equipment will be removed and returned to you. Consider yourselves lucky if that is all that happens." 2 more trucks arrived, and federal agents began carefully removing equipment from my container. They were methodical and professional, documenting everything with photos and written notes. The HOA's landscaping equipment was unceremoniously pulled out and dumped on my lawn. Tom Chen arrived about an hour into the process. He took one look at the scene, the federal agents, the marshals, and Deborah sitting on my back porch looking like she might be sick, and gave me a questioning look. "It escalated quickly," I said. "I can see that." He approached Marshal Rodriguez and introduced himself as my attorney. They spoke for a few minutes while I watched the agents work. The whole process took about 4 hours. By the time they were done, my container was completely empty. The federal equipment was loaded into secured trucks. My personal equipment was inventoried and stacked in my garage with the promise it would be returned after review. and the HOA's equipment sat in a sad pile on my lawn. Before they left, Marshal Rodriguez had Deborah sign several documents acknowledging what had happened and confirming that the HOA relinquished any claim to the container or its contents. "Am I going to be arrested?" Deborah asked, her Karen attitude completely deflated. "As I said, that will be up to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Someone will be in contact with you. I strongly suggest you retain legal counsel." After the marshals and agents left, Peterson pulled me aside. "Hart, I am sorry you had to deal with this. Not your fault, sir. The security review should be completed within a week. Assuming everything checks out, and I do not anticipate any issues, your equipment will be returned and you can resume normal operations. However, I am recommending that you find a more secure location for federal property going forward." "Understood, sir. I will make arrangements." He left, and I was finally alone with Tom and a pile of lawn equipment in my yard. "So," Tom said, "that was perhaps the most dramatic HOA dispute resolution I have ever witnessed. Think it is over? Not even close. The federal investigation is one thing, but you still have your civil claims against the HOA. Theft, conversion, trespass, violation of your property rights, plus emotional distress, legal fees, and any damages to your equipment or your federal contract work. I just want my container back and for them to leave me alone. You will get that and more. But Brandon, you need to understand something. The HOA is going to fight this. Deborah might be in over her head with the federal side, but the HOA itself has insurance and lawyers. They are going to claim they had authority under the CC and Articus, which they did not. I know that and we can prove it, but it is going to be a battle." He was right, of course. The next few weeks were a nightmare of depositions, statements, and documentation. The federal investigation moved surprisingly quickly, probably because Peterson was pushing it hard. Deborah, Rick, and the HOA itself were all subjects of the investigation. About a week after the incident, I got my personal equipment back along with my container, which the marshals had taken into custody as evidence but no longer needed. They even replaced my broken lock with a new, more secure one. 2 weeks after that, I received notice that Deborah Finch had been charged with theft of government property and interference with a federal contract. Rick, who had helped her open the container, was charged as an accessory. The maximum penalties were serious, potentially years in prison and heavy fines, though the U.S. attorney indicated that a plea deal was likely given that this was a first offense and no actual damage had occurred. The civil case moved slower, as civil cases do. Tom filed suit against the HOA for 15 different violations, seeking damages of $200,000. The HOA's insurance company hired a big law firm out of Scottsdale to defend them. 3 months after the incident, I sat in a conference room at Tom's office for a mediation session. On the other side of the table were the HOA's lawyers, a representative from their insurance company, and surprisingly, Susan, the board member who had walked away during the initial seizure. Deborah was not there because she was still dealing with her criminal charges. The insurance company's lawyer, a woman named Patricia Knowles, did most of the talking. "Mr. Hart, my clients deeply regret the incident that occurred. However, we believe that the damages you are claiming are excessive. Your client stole my property and potentially derailed a federal contract," Tom said. "My client has documentation of hours spent dealing with this situation, federal investigations, and security reviews, not to mention the emotional distress of having his property seized. The HOA was attempting to enforce its rules. The HOA violated its own rules, We have 3 separate expert opinions confirming that Mr. Hart's container did not violate any provision of the CC and Articles. The seizure was illegal from every angle. Patricia glanced at her notes. We are prepared to offer $50,000 to settle this matter and to permanently waive any restrictions on Mr. Hart's storage container. Tom looked at me. We had discussed this beforehand. I nodded slightly. We will accept $150,000, a written apology from the HOA board, and the immediate removal and resignation of Deborah Finch from any HOA position or authority, Tom countered. Mrs. Finch has already resigned as president due to her legal situation, Susan spoke up for the first time. I am now the board president, and speaking personally, I am horrified by what happened. I walked away because I knew it was wrong. Patricia consulted with the insurance representative in hushed tones. Finally, she said, we can do $100,000, the written apology, and confirmation that Mrs. Finch will not hold any HOA position going forward. We can also put in writing that Mr. Hart's storage container and any similar structures are pre-approved for his property. Tom looked at me again. It was less than we were asking for, but still a substantial amount. More importantly, it meant this would be over without years of litigation. Deal, I said. The paperwork was drawn up over the next week. The HOA's insurance company cut me a check for $100,000. The HOA board, now led by Susan, issued a formal written apology that was distributed to all residents, explaining what had happened and making it clear that my container had never violated any rules. They also amended the HOA bylaws to explicitly allow storage containers that met certain reasonable criteria. The criminal case against Deborah took longer. About 6 months after the incident, she pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of interference with government property. She received 2 years probation, a $10,000 fine, and 100 hours of community service. Rick, who cooperated fully and testified that he had been pressured by Deborah, got probation and a smaller fine. During Deborah's sentencing hearing, which I attended, the judge had some choice words for her. Mrs. Finch, the judge said, you are fortunate that no classified material was compromised and that no actual damage occurred to federal property. However, your actions demonstrate a shocking disregard for both the law and basic common sense. You were explicitly warned that you were dealing with federal property, yet you proceeded anyway out of what appears to be simple stubbornness and a desire to exert authority you did not have. This court takes seriously any interference with government operations. Your sentence reflects both the seriousness of your actions and your lack of criminal history. I hope you have learned that being president of a homeowners association does not place you above the law. Deborah stood there, tears running down her face, and nodded. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Life slowly returned to normal after that. My container sat behind my house, properly secured and completely legal. The new HOA board under Susan's leadership was reasonable and followed their own rules. I continued my work as a DoD contractor without further incident. About a year after everything happened, I was outside doing some maintenance on my container when Susan walked up. We had developed a cordial relationship since she took over as president. Brandon, I wanted to thank you, she said. For what? For not suing me personally. I know I was there when Deborah cut your lock. I should have done more to stop her. You walked away. That showed good judgment. I should have walked away sooner. I should never have gone with her in the first place. She paused. The old board was toxic. Deborah ran it like her personal fiefdom. Since everything happened, we have completely reorganized. We actually follow the rules now instead of making up new ones. whenever someone does something the president does not like. That is good to hear. We also voted to put term limits on board positions and to require board decisions to be approved by homeowner vote for anything involving property seizure or significant penalties. What happened to you should never happen to anyone. I appreciated that. How is the neighborhood overall? Better, honestly. A lot of people were afraid to do anything because Deborah would fine them or harass them. Now people actually use their properties the way they want, within reasonable rules. We are a community again, not a dictatorship. She left, and I went back to work on my container. As I was tightening a bolt on the door mechanism, I thought about everything that had happened. It had been stressful, expensive even after the settlement, and time-consuming. But in a weird way, it had improved the whole neighborhood. Sometimes it takes a dramatic incident to expose and fix a broken system. My phone rang. It was Lieutenant Colonel Peterson, who I still worked with regularly. Hart, I wanted to give you an update. You remember how we conducted that security review of your setup after the incident? Of course. Well, your response to the situation and your security protocols actually impressed some people at the Pentagon. Your documentation was flawless, your notification procedures were textbook, and you handled a potentially serious security breach exactly right. We are going to be using your incident as a case study in our contractor security training. I was not sure whether to be proud or embarrassed. A case study in what not to let happen, Peterson laughed. A case study in proper response when something does go wrong. You did everything right, Brandon, from how you secured the equipment initially to how you handled the breach. The fact that a homeowners association president thought she could seize federal property is not your fault. Thank you, sir. After hanging up, I stood there looking at my container. It was just a big metal box, really. But it had become the center of an incident involving federal agents, U.S., marshals, lawyers, criminal charges, and a six-figure settlement. All because someone on a power trip thought HOA authority trumped property rights and federal law. I thought about all the stories I had heard about HOAs over the years. Fights over paint colors, grass height, holiday decorations. Most of them seemed petty, but they all came from the same place. People given a little bit of authority who let it go to their heads. Deborah could have simply accepted my explanation and documentation that the container was legal. She could have moved on to actual violations. Instead, she chose to escalate and escalate until she crossed a line that brought federal law enforcement to my backyard. The irony was that I had actually been planning to move. I liked my house, but the HOA drama had been wearing on me even before the container incident. After the settlement and the board changes, though, I decided to stay. The neighborhood was genuinely better now. The new board was reasonable. And my container sat there, a metal monument to the fact that even HOAs have limits to their power. I finished my maintenance and went back inside. My home office looked the same as it had that morning when I had seen Deborah walking past with her bolt cutter, but everything had changed. I had stood up to an overreaching HOA. I had protected federal property, and I had been vindicated both in criminal court and civil court. That evening, I was sitting on my back porch, enjoying the Arizona sunset and a cold beer, when my neighbor from the other side came over. His name was Mike Torres, and we had been friendly since I moved in. "Hey, Brandon, got a minute?" he called from the fence line. "Sure, come on over." He walked around and joined me on the porch. "I wanted to ask you something." The new HOA board sent out a survey asking what rules people wanted changed. I am thinking about proposing that we allow sheds and workshops, but I wanted your opinion given everything you went through. What kind of restrictions are you thinking? Size limits has to be on your property, obviously. cannot be visible from the street. Basically, the same rules that already apply to your container. Sounds reasonable to me. The key is having it actually written in the bylaws so no one can arbitrarily decide something does not count. That is what I figured. He paused. You know, a lot of people were really angry when they found out what Deborah did to you. There was talk of trying to dissolve the whole HOA. Can you even do that? Legally, yeah, but it is complicated. Would have required a supermajority vote and agreement from the city. Ultimately, people decided it was easier to just fix the board and the rules. Probably the right call. An HOA can be useful if it is run properly. Pool maintenance, common area upkeep, that kind of thing. True. Mike stood up. Anyway, thanks for the input, and thanks for standing up to Deborah. I think a lot of us wanted to over the years but did not have the guts. After he left, I thought about that. I had not set out to be some kind of HOA crusader. I just wanted to store my equipment legally. But sometimes you have to fight back against unreasonable authority, whether it is a government, a corporation, or a homeowners association. The next morning, I was back at work when Tom Chen called. Good news. The settlement check cleared, and after my fees and costs, you are getting $85,000. Great, thank you for everything, Tom. Thank you for the case. Honestly, it was one of the most satisfying ones I have ever worked. Clients usually do not get video evidence of the HOA literally cutting their locks off. Happy to provide entertainment value. One more thing. I have been contacted by a legal journal wanting to write about the case. They want to interview both of us. You interested? What would they publish? An article about HOA overreach and property rights. It would be anonymous as far as your name, but the details of the case would be public record anyway. Sure, why not? Maybe it will help someone else dealing with a crazy HOA. The interview happened a few weeks later. The article came out 2 months after that in a property law journal. I got a kick out of seeing my container described as a secure storage unit for sensitive materials, and Deborah described as an HOA president who exceeded her authority with disastrous consequences. Life continued to settle down. My work went smoothly. The HOA stayed out of my business. I even started to enjoy living in Meadowbrook Estates again. Susan and the new board were genuinely trying to build a better community, and it showed. About 18 months after the incident, I got an unexpected visitor. It was Rick, the former board member who had helped Deborah cut my lock. He looked nervous as he stood at my door. Brandon, I know you probably do not want to see me, but I wanted to apologize in person. I considered closing the door but decided to hear him out. Okay. What I did was wrong. I knew it was wrong when Deborah asked me to help, and I did it anyway because I was afraid of her. She had a way of making you feel like if you did not do what she wanted, she would make your life hell. But that is not an excuse. I should have stood up to her like Susan did. You testified against her at her trial, right? Yeah. Told the truth about how she planned the whole thing and pressured me into helping. I think it helped get my charges reduced. Probably. Anyway, I wanted you to know that I am sorry, really sorry. And I am glad the federal agents got your stuff back quickly. When I heard they were involved, I almost had a heart attack. I almost smiled at that. It was educational for everyone involved. I learned that HOAs are not worth going to jail over, that is for sure. He started to leave, then turned back. You handling the whole thing the way you did, knowing exactly who to call and having all your documentation ready, that was impressive. Most people would have just yelled and accomplished nothing. After he left, I thought about that. He was right in a way. If I had not had my documentation, if I had not known to immediately contact my DOD liaison, if I had not recorded everything, the situation could have gone very differently. The HOA might have gotten away with it, or at least dragged it out for years. That evening, I decided to write up a summary of everything that had happened and what I had learned. I posted it on a few online forums dedicated to HOA issues. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people commented with their own HOA horror stories. Many asked for advice on dealing with similar situations. I ended up writing a detailed guide on how to protect yourself from HOA overreach. The key points were simple. Know your bylaws better than the board does. Document everything. Never give the HOA permission to access your property without a proper legal process. And do not be afraid to escalate to law enforcement or courts when necessary. One comment stuck with me. Someone wrote, HOAs only have as much power as you let them have. They rely on people being intimidated and not fighting back. Your story shows what happens when someone stands their ground. That was true, but it missed an important point. You could only stand your ground effectively if you were actually in the right. I had been in full compliance with the HOA rules. If I had actually violated the bylaws, I would not have had a leg to stand on. The lesson was not just to fight back against HOAs, but to make sure you were following the rules in the first place so you could fight from a position of strength. 2 years after the incident, almost to the day, the neighborhood had its annual HOA meeting. These used to be contentious affairs under Deborah's leadership, with lots of arguing and people getting fined for speaking out of turn. Under Susan's leadership, they were actually productive. At this particular meeting, Susan announced that she was stepping down as president after her term ended. I want to thank everyone for trusting me to help rebuild this board after the unfortunate incidents 2 years ago. I am proud of what we have accomplished together. We have reformed our bylaws to prevent abuse, we have improved our community facilities, and we have created an environment where people actually want to live rather than feeling oppressed by their own HOA. There was genuine applause. Several people spoke up nominating candidates for the next board. To my surprise, Mike Torres nominated me. Brandon Hart stood up to corruption in this HOA and helped expose serious problems. I think he would make an excellent board member. Multiple people seconded the nomination. I was not sure what to say. Part of me wanted nothing to do with the HOA board after everything that had happened. But another part of me thought that maybe I could help make sure nothing like the Deborah situation ever happened again. I will accept the nomination, I said, but only if we agree on one condition. The board serves the community, not the other way around. We enforce reasonable rules fairly and we never, ever abuse our authority for personal reasons. More applause. When the votes were counted, I had been elected to the board along with 4 other reasonable, level-headed people. Susan stayed on as a regular member to help with the transition. As I drove home that night, I thought about how strange life could be. 2 years ago, the HOA president had seized my property and ended up facing federal charges. Now, I was on the HOA board myself. But it made sense in a way. If you want things to be better, sometimes you have to be willing to step up and make them better yourself. My storage container still sat behind my house, properly secured and completely legal. It had been at the center of one of the most dramatic HOA disputes in recent memory. Federal marshals had been involved, criminal charges had been filed, a 6-figure settlement had been paid. And it had all happened within the span of a few months, all because someone on a power trip had thought they could seize whatever they wanted. Looking back, the craziest part was how quickly the federal response had happened. From the moment I called Lieutenant Colonel Peterson to the moment U.S. Marshals showed up at my house was only about 6 hours. They had treated it as a serious security incident because that was exactly what it was. Deborah had gambled that I was bluffing about federal property, and she had lost that bet in the most spectacular way possible. I often wondered what would have happened if the equipment in my container had not been federal property. I still would have had civil claims, and the HOA still would have been in the wrong, but would it have been resolved so quickly and decisively? Probably not. The federal involvement had changed everything. It had turned what could have been a years-long civil dispute into a clear-cut case of criminal conduct that was resolved in months. But even without the federal angle, the core principle remained the same. The HOA had no right to seize my property. They had no authority to break my lock and take possession of something that belonged to me. The fact that they thought they did showed how warped their understanding of their own power had become. As a new HOA board member, I made it my mission to ensure that kind of thinking never took hold again. At my first board meeting, I proposed that we create a homeowner's bill of rights that would be distributed to every resident and posted on the community website. It would clearly outline what the HOA could and could not do, what rights homeowners had, and how to file complaints or appeals. The rest of the board loved the idea. We worked with Tom Chen to draft it, making sure every provision was legally sound and aligned with Arizona law. When it was done, it was a clear, readable document that any homeowner could understand. No more ambiguity, no more making up rules on the fly. We also implemented a requirement that any enforcement action taken by the HOA had to be approved by at least 3 board members, with documentation of what rule was violated and what evidence supported the violation. No more single board members making unilateral decisions. The changes worked. Over the next year, complaints about HOA overreach dropped to basically zero. People felt comfortable using their properties without fear of arbitrary fines or harassment. The community actually felt like a community again. I stayed on the board for 3 years before deciding not to run for re-election. By that point, the reforms were well established, and new board members who understood the importance of respecting homeowner rights were being elected. My work was done. My storage container never caused another problem. It sat behind my house for 5 more years until I finally moved, not because of HOA issues, but because I got a new job opportunity in Colorado. When I sold the house, the new owners were actually excited about the container. They were also contractors and needed secure storage. During the final walkthrough, the buyer asked me about the container's history. I gave him a brief version of the story. His eyes went wide. That actually happened. An HOA president got charged by federal prosecutors. It actually happened. There are court records if you do not believe me. That is insane, but it explains why this HOA seems so reasonable compared to others I looked at. That is exactly why. Sometimes it takes a major incident to fix a broken system. I moved to Colorado and bought a house with no HOA. I had had enough of homeowners associations, even reformed ones, to last me a lifetime. My new house sat on 2 acres with no neighbors close enough to complain about anything. I built a proper workshop and never had to worry about anyone seizing it. But I never forgot the lessons I learned from the Meadowbrook Estates incident. Know your rights. Document everything. Do not let anyone intimidate you into accepting violations of your property rights. And when necessary, escalate to whatever authority can actually resolve the situation, whether that is lawyers, courts, or in my case, federal marshals. The story of how the HOA seized my storage container and federal marshals seized it back within hours became something of a legend in HOA dispute circles. It showed up in legal journals, on forums, and even in a few news articles. People used it as an example of HOA overreach, and the importance of standing up for your rights. I occasionally got messages from people dealing with their own HOA problems, asking for advice. I always told them the same thing. Make sure you are in the right first, document everything second, and do not be afraid to fight back third. Most HOA disputes never get to the point mine did because most HOA boards are not willing to risk criminal charges and federal involvement. But the threat of serious consequences is often enough to make them back down. Years later, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Deborah Finch had moved away from Phoenix entirely. The criminal conviction and the publicity from the case had made her something of a pariah in the community. She completed her probation and paid her fines, but her reputation never recovered. I did not take any pleasure in that. She had brought it on herself with her actions, but it was still a steep price to pay for a power trip. Rick, the board member who had helped her, stayed in the neighborhood but kept a low profile. He never got involved in HOA affairs again. Susan continued to be an active community member and was well respected for her role in reforming the board. As for me, I moved on with my life, but I never forgot those few chaotic days in March when my storage container became the center of a federal investigation. It was a reminder that even in suburban America, even in conflicts that seem mundane, the rule of law matters. Nobody is above it, not even a homeowners association president with a bolt cutter and an inflated sense of authority. The whole experience taught me that systems of governance, no matter how small, need checks and balances. An HOA might seem trivial compared to city, state, or federal government, but to the people living under its rules, it matters just as much. When those running the system forget that they serve the community rather than rule it, things go wrong quickly. In the end, justice was served. The HOA was reformed. Deborah faced consequences for her actions. I got my property back and was compensated for my troubles. And perhaps most importantly, the neighborhood became a better place to live. Sometimes it takes a crisis to create positive change, and while I would not have chosen to go through that experience, I was glad that some good came from it. Looking back now, years later and hundreds of miles away, I could see the whole incident with clarity. It was about more than just a storage container. It was about respect for property rights, about the limits of authority, about standing up for yourself when someone tries to bully you. And it was about the fact that in America, even federal marshals will show up to protect those principles when necessary. My storage container sat in my new workshop in Colorado, still holding some of my equipment, no longer holding anything federal. It was just a metal box, scarred and weathered from years of use. But to me, it represented something important. It represented standing your ground, knowing your rights, and refusing to be intimidated. And whenever I looked at it, I remembered the look on Deborah's face when U.S. Marshals showed up in my backyard. That moment when she realized that her authority as HOA president meant absolutely nothing in the face of actual law. That moment when all her bluster and confidence evaporated. That was the moment she learned the most important lesson any petty tyrant needs to learn. There are consequences for abusing power. The story of my HOA seizing my storage container and federal marshals seizing it back became a tale I told at parties, a lesson I shared with friends dealing with their own HOA issues, and a reminder to myself about the importance of documentation and knowing when to escalate. It was dramatic, it was stressful, and it was absolutely worth fighting for.